think one thing that is really exciting about this particular event happening in this space now is because of the authors who will be here and like welcoming them into this physical space, because the events that we've had the very first times we met were virtual. At the height, really at the height of the pandemic, these authors, along with another author in the audience, Angie Cruz, really saved us. I don't know how to, I was thinking I could read your bios and say what books but really what I want to say is that you saved us. Caro, Jaquira, it's like that, the timing of the El Gran Combo event that happened online where, there was so many layers of it. There were ways to support multiple bookstores, multiple authors, and then all of the different readers that would want to engage in, different ways. And also all of us trying to learn how to use all of these things, the Zooms and everything. It was a time, and it was, I think, our first real big event during that time, and we were just shocked that it was so strange to make this event, and then as we had it, we were chatting offline. I think this is one of the best events we've ever had, among the staff and among the collective, and there's so much, all of the things that, of all the things that were lost in that time are still being lost. There are many gains, and I think one of those is like that, everything that came out of that time, that event, and the community that was built up, thanks to you two. So thank you, welcome. You will talk about your books. And yes, I could read your actual bios, or if you want to just come on up. Let me just go for it. Let's do it. You'll do it? Okay.
We'll do it.
I got, yeah.
Wow. I got tearful. I just want to say, I want to give a big shout out to Angie Cruz, who's in the audience, who's actually single-handedly that year was like, we need to save our bookstores. What do we do? Let's get together. Let's think about this, and brought us all together.
Mm-hmm. The text threads, the Zooms, and Angie, the spark behind it all, truly.
Yeah. So thank you. Thank you all for being here. This is such a wonderful space and a wonderful community, and I'm so grateful for you all for being here. I'm so grateful for this book and for Caro. And rather than reading Caro's bio, I want to tell you something really interesting that I just learned. Caro is known in our communities as the king of kink.
Wait, what?
First of their name. So if you have any questions about kinky craft, queering kinky sentences, this is the king of kink right here. So one of the things that I wanted us to do is to start, I guess, with an introduction to this book. I have very long questions, so I have to read them so I don't forget. But so many of us know you, Caro, as a force in Latina literature, especially when it comes to writing the stories of queer Latinas and Latin American women. So many of us saw ourselves in your work again and again as you wrote books centered around Latina characters, about building and sustaining queer community among Latina women, and as you wrote about political violence and resistance. The Palace of Eros is a different kind of book for you, and I love how part of what this work does is it opens up possibilities. As I was reading, I kept returning to the idea that there are no limits to what we can do in writing, right, as Latina writers, and no limits to what we can do in art making. There's definitely, I think this is a feminist book. There is what I would call resistance in this book. You have protagonists who are essentially, by loving each other and existing, even in secret, resisting the binds and the limits imposed by patriarchy. And I would love it if you could talk a little bit about your inspiration for the Palace of Eros, or the genesis of the book. How did you decide to write a story that was so different from your other work?
Ay, Dios mío, thank you for that question. And I only found out tonight about this King of Kink thing too. So, you know, it's all very fresh and exciting. Thank you, Word Up, for hosting us. Thank you, Jaquira, for taking the time and being this conversation. I just love you and your work always, every day. And anyone who's not read Ordinary Girls, I mean, we're going to keep talking about it, but so incredibly brilliant. Just such incredible essential work that is so inspiring to me. So thank you. And thank you all. And I really appreciate the generosity of thought that you put into that context and the kindness of it. And also the deeper context, right? Because this is my 6th novel. And I have written 5 novels, all set in Latin America, and drawing on my roots and these root stories and wanting to like impulsar, right? And reweave certainly queer stories and women's stories, feminist stories, and trans stories since my first novel, The Invisible Mountain, which came out in 2009 and had a trans character. Always wanting to be, you know, sort of inclusive of the fabric of voices who've been silenced, which is Latinx voices here in the United States, and then is so many voices within Latinidad and within Latin America, even though we've always existed and we've always been part of the fabric of that. It did feel like a risk in some ways to move beyond that, but I also have been inspired by the careers of people who resist the idea that we have to stay in whatever pigeonhole people might have for us, because also Latina writers should be able to talk about everything and have a broad landscape. Yeah. Right? Yeah. And so, and I also want to write queer stories throughout time. Certainly in our current times and in the last 100 years, but also, as I have in previous books, but also we queer and trans folks have always existed, but have not been part of the official histories. So this is sort of taking some of the themes that have been urgent and important to me and taking them into an ancient setting, which in some ways breathes new life and new questions and urgency, but also sort of an urgency that connects to the thematic concerns that we have today within our comunidades. In terms of the specific inspiration, this particular Greek myth, the myth of Psyche and Eros, is one that I've been deeply obsessed with since I was about 19. And in fact, there were some very secret pages of an attempt to write a version of the Psyche and Eros myth that I wrote when I was about 20 years old. I have no idea where they are. I haven't seen them in years. And that's probably for the best. I'm not sorry. But that tells me that even then I was trying to write my way in and reimagine it, that there was something about this ancient story wherein two people, or a deity and a mortal woman, meet only in the dark. And their connection is forbidden, and they have this transgressive but incredibly passionate connection that sort of defies the rules of both human and divine law. And I didn't really understand with my conscious mind at the time what pulled me about this story. And it wasn't until about 25 years later that I was circling different ideas for my next book, and I came to this idea, kind of like a light bulb. What if Eros, aka Cupid, who is the ancient Greek god of love and desire, were a genderqueer, non-binary lesbian goddess? Right? How does that change the story? And of course it changes everything. Yeah. Once that transgressive, passionate sexual connection at the heart of the story is a queer one, and once one of the characters' gender is also defiant, it opened up all these burning questions that I wanted to explore and understand.
Oh, beautiful, beautiful. I feel like you just answered like 6 of my questions, yeah. But
okay.
But I would love to know if there was anything that was particularly surprising or challenging, considering everything you just said, considering writing queer and trans characters, about a Greek myth retelling, about the work you were doing in the writing or in the publishing process.
Was there anything surprising about it?
Surprising or challenging?
I mean, there's interesting challenges in retelling a myth and then wanting to, in some ways, be very faithful to what was true about what we know, because there's a lot we don't know about how people lived in ancient times in southern Italy, which is where I set the book, actually not in Greece. The Greeks colonized southern Italy, and I have some ancestors who are actually from the exact part of land that this book takes place on.
Wow.
And I did that because I thought, well, it gave me a kind of personal urgency of like, technically, Psyche could be my ancestor from 2,500 years ago. But it also gave me this opportunity to layer in themes of colonization.
Yeah.
Right? This mortal character comes from this colonized community. Her grandmother spoke the indigenous tongue of her land. It was probably Etruscan. Scholars aren't sure, so I didn't name the language. But she sort of she's inhabiting this feeling of lost language and heritage and colonization that allowed me to bring in themes that are important to me as a Latinx person. So that was an interesting sort of challenge, but also joy to weave in. And then something that surprised me was how much genderqueer and trans material there actually is in the ancient Greek stories.
Yeah. Oh, I love hearing that. I hear a lot about that at home from Lars, my partner, who is like obsessed with antiquity and all the ways that queerness and transness already existed and just was like erased or unnamed.
Absolutely.
I love that. Speaking of Etruscan, which in the book is called the Old Tongue, I love that. And I would love to hear a little bit more about language and thinking about the Old Tongue and thinking about the ways that Psyche thinks of language and queering of language and even the words she uses. Even she says that she wants, she's thinking about expanding what a word can even mean, expanding the meaning of a word or rejecting, like, for example, the word wife.
Yes.
But I would love to hear about the queering of language in the book, and if you can talk about maybe the Old Tongue or how you approach the queering of language.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I mean, one of the things that I really wanted to write into and that I'm always interested in and have been interested in my past books too, interested is sort of almost a flaccid word for it, like, that has really fascinated me and drawn me, is writing into the spaces of queer truth in places and times that preceded the lexicon that we have today. Right? I mean, many of us, I'm Gen X. I grew up in a time when the lexicon that we have today was not fully available, right? There were fewer words, right? And so as we proliferate this incredibly beautiful, amazing, wonderful language, even around gender, we have, gender queer and non-binary and gender fluid and transmasculine, transfeminine, trans, and so many more words, butch, so many words. At the same time, right, these energies and qualities are not as new as the lexicon. I think that's so important because these days in mainstream media, and certainly the right wing, likes to hold up this narrative that this is sort of new thing that young people have invented, right?
Trend. So
queerness, transness, non-binary, it's just a trend. All the little kids are talking about they, them, because they don't understand how things used to be. Well, how things used to be is that we were always here, right? But what are the ways that, and this is what really fascinates me, is what are the ways that when we have within us a vast and shimmering truth that shines beyond the language of our society, how do we find ways to language ourselves or to at least see and know ourselves? How do we translate ourselves into either the lexicon that is available to us or the lexicon we stretch open and invent? When we feel that pull for more words. And so Psyche, she's a mortal girl. She goes through all this stuff at the beginning, right? She's sort of perceived as beautiful, and these suitors come and gaze at her, but it's not a good scene because she has no control or agency. She's sort of subjected to the patriarchy, and then she's left for dead by her village. And so, because she's sort of failed at fulfilling the role that her father wants her to fulfill, and the oracle has said she's going to have a monstrous marriage. So all of those things happen to her and at her, and then she ends up at this palace where she's invited to name and experience her own desire. This is so new for her So what is that like to be a young queer person, have no language for it, but then be invited to sit with your internal experience? And for me, writing that was an opportunity to sit with the ways that I think we queer folks and trans folks and Latinx folks and immigrant folks have always been innovators of culture and language and knowing.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I love that. I feel like that's a good segue to kind of read a little bit from the book, so that since we're already in the palace, we've arrived.
Okay.
Maybe you can read a little bit from the book.
Sure. I'm going to read from the book. And so tonight, you thought that, yes, I could read from one of the racy parts.
I want to hear some sex. I don't know about you all, but
Okay.
I'm making this decision for us.
Excellent.
Since you're
Okay.
the king of kink.
Okay.
Enjoy it. You're welcome.
All right. So, I have done events where I'm like, oh, I'm not going to read the steamy bits. But it is a book with the word Eros in the title. And
Exactly.
And one of the protagonists is actually called Eros and is like the queer, non-binary lesbian goddess of desire. So there are steamy bits in this book. And I'm going to read from this part where Psyche, so the book moves back and forth between Psyche and Eros' points of view. And this is from Psyche's point of view. And she's in this place where there are two rules. One is that Eros has put down. She said, this palace is a place where you can have whatever wish you like, and we can be together if you like. But there are two rules. We must never light the lamp. No light in this room. It has to stay dark. And 2, you must never ask me who I am. So there's a lot of mystery here. And this is a night when Psyche learns something more about Eros. She says to Eros, what does she say? She says, tell me a secret, something you're scared to share. And Eros begins by saying, I am not a normal woman. I am a woman, but I'm also more. I do not understand, I said, but I want to. Taron kissed me, long and slow. Are you sure? Yes, of course. And I meant it. With every fiber of myself, I wanted to understand. She guided my hand to her sex. I moved there, intrigued, delighted, for it was a thrilling place for my hand to be, and it seemed perhaps this was what Taron meant, that she was more than a woman because normal women did not do such things, did not ask directly for other women to touch them. An idea I could swim with, could swim through. But Taron took my wrist gently, stilled it. I would have asked why. I opened my mouth to form the question, but then I stopped, held my breath. What was this? In my hand? Change. Metamorphosis, swift and smooth. The nub of her grew large and long into a shaft, still warm, still firm, alive against my palm. What? It's what you think it is. But I had no thoughts. I was all thought. My mind became translucent and filled with the dark, as if I suddenly had no skin, no borders, no defenses at all, and I could only feel the rush of it, succumb to a great black swirl of night. Like a man's? Like a man's. I drew my hand away instinctively, brought it slowly back. Are you afraid? No, I said, though I wasn't sure. Inside me, an inscrutable darkness, something monstrous. I can ungrow it. No, don't, unless you want to. I want to know what you're thinking. Where to begin? This palace, this dark round chamber, had dismantled everything I knew of the world or thought I had known. Wonder, curiosity, exhilaration, a slash of fear. Does it hurt to do that? To change? No, she laughed, not at all. But how is it possible? Psyche, beloved, who defines the possible? The gods, I said, before I knew my own mind, before I could reflect on whether it was true. Ah, the gods. Let's say the gods define what's possible. Well, rumor has it, does it not, that they can metamorphose? Zeus into a swan, nymphs into trees. Yes? So take Zeus, the feathers, the beak, the lengthening neck. Isn't that all more drastic change than this? I suppose. Then why shouldn't this exist? Her logic only raised more questions, but I could not tame the chaos of my thoughts. I wanted to rove over Tehran, discover her body anew. Who cared about the why and what and is its possibles when there was this, the simple, here it is, what next? Everything next, I thought. It touched me, too. The sudden shyness in Tehran was usually the incarnation of daring, the one who had taught me how to unlatch, the one who boldly forged the way to ecstasy along 1,000 paths, now revealing this new dimension of herself as if she had feared that I would spurn her, that her bride might shrink away in disgust, as if there were a vulnerable spot inside her that she was now making known, and that evoked in me a fierce love along with a wave of relief that I was not the only one to bear soft parts, like a snail venturing out of its shell, easily crushed, yet craving the sun. I drew her in for a kiss. Our mouths met, deep and slow. I wrapped my legs around her, used them to pull her hips toward mine. You don't have to, she whispered into my ear, breath ragged. I know. We moved against each other, and soon she was inside me, as she had been before, with her hands and tongue, and it was her, still her, ever my Tehran in her many-shaped hungers, my same lover continuing the same music we had been making all this time, and I could welcome her with all my being, could wrap my thighs around her and pull her in as together we rode and rode the mare of our delight. So this, I thought, as I dug nails into her back, this is what we do. We seek this over and over, tangling our bodies into shapes of our invention. How many forms can we make together? Are they infinite? Are we infinite? I wondered as she collapsed against me, teeth still buried in my flesh. We lay together in a sumptuous silence for a long time. So, she finally said, you're not disgusted? Ha! What? Did I seem disgusted? She laughed tentatively. Not exactly. How could I ever be disgusted by you? She was quiet. Tehran, you constantly amaze me. You are like no other woman, Psyche. I smiled, remembered I couldn't be seen, made a sound of delight. But what you said about Zeus, when he became a swan, as legend has it, he was still male. That was the whole point of it, after all. He did it to ravage Leda. Ha! And he thinks he has to be male to do that. Tehran? What? I thought of what might happen if the gods could hear us, the scoffing in her voice. In my village, no one would have dared to mock Zeus. You're right. You don't have to be male to ravage someone. Well, I know it now, my love. But what I'm saying is, when he changes into a swan, eagle, serpent, any animal form, that part of him, as far as we know, has stayed the same. Perhaps he gives it plumage. Poor Leda! She laughed, and I joined her. Psyche, I thought, look what you've become, daring to laugh at Zeus himself. I was amazed by my brazenness, enthralled by it, scared of where it might lead. Yes, Tehran said, poor Leda. But that's a different matter. It's not that Zeus cannot change that part of himself, but that he does not. Does that really make a difference? Of course it does. Do you know what it means? What? That it's Zeus who suffers from a lack of imagination. Thank you.
Thank you. So thank you for that. You're welcome again. I requested Caro read from this because I would love to talk about not just Eros' cock, but I would love to talk about the fact that Eros is a goddess who is not just a goddess that can grow a cock, but also that there's something innate about her gender. It's expansive. It's not just I'm a woman who can grow a cock. And part of what Eros has to contend with in the book, in the past, before we meet her, is that patriarchy, right? Zeus has stripped her of autonomy, and she can't be her most authentic self. She can't be her whole self. And until she meets Psyche, which kind of changes her world. I would love to hear you talk a little bit about that, and possibly about how your own relationship with your own gender, or your own gender journey, kind of informed some of this writing.
Yeah, okay. There were so many layers there. Yes, so there are so many different ways to be genderqueer, to be gender expansive, to be trans. And there were choices that I made about, what Eros's experience of gender would be. But very importantly, we have here a divine being, a goddess, right? She oversees a goddess or non-binary deity, however we want to frame it, who oversees this primal life force of Eros. And yet, even she can feel the sting of diminishment because she lives in patriarchy. Because the Greek divine pantheon is patriarchal, right? Zeus, if you look at the old stories, right? Zeus, as the god of gods, right, would rape nymphs and felt entitled to rape whichever nymph he liked. And there are stories where Zeus tries to get Eros to kind of participate in that labor. Labor is really not an appropriate word for it. But, I think there is a way in which I think I'm always writing about what it means to live in patriarchy, how patriarchy seeks to limit and confine us. And yet we are internally vast. Right? Whether it's women and girls, whether it's gay men and boys, whether it's queer people, whether it's boys and men. I mean, everybody is sort of diminished by these rigid structures. And so it was really joyful for me to write this character and be able to have her be in her consciousness about what her gender truth is, and then be navigating what it is to live her whole self and what she's pushing up against, like, in the halls of the gods, right, in this divine context. So she has to kind of realize that the heavens are limited. By making this room where the connection is a secret and she can only be her full self in the dark room, it has a kind of parable relationship to the realities of the closet. Right? Everybody has a different journey among queer and trans folks, but sometimes people feel like I have to hide this part of myself or some aspect of this part of myself in order to be free, in order to be safe, right? And there are many different ways that we can navigate ways to be safe, and there isn't one right answer, but there is a cost to that kind of hiding or self-diminishment as well. So it gave me a chance to explore that too. And in Eros's case, right, Eros is not a binary trans person or character in the sense that, like, her most liberated journey is not to be a trans man, to move into living, constantly and stably inside maleness, but rather that she's very gender expansive. And she sort of says at one point, I think, she's unruly and immense internally, right? She's pure ungendered starlight. She's male, she's female. She's the flow between, the flow within, the flow of all of it. And so again, it's sort of trying to language these things that feel beyond language. I think for many of us, I mean, I don't want to speak for all folks, but I feel like for me, having an expansive gender, being a genderqueer person, for me, there are a lot of terms that resonate in different ways, and simultaneously my gender is beyond language, and I know I'm not the only person who feels this way. But the terms for me include gender fluid, gender queer, non-binary, transmasculine, butch, and woman. All of those terms have a resonance for me and in a part of my experience of my gender. And I want room for all of us to really just be whole and to really just have the freedom and the possibility to just live our whole selves, whatever it looks like, right? And that's my beloved, you know, like trans man and trans woman friends, and the folks with very expansive genders, and my agender people, and, you know, everybody, all of the different thousands of possible genders in the constellation. It's really not a gender spectrum, it's a constellation, you know, because even a spectrum implies a kind of movement between two poles. And it's so much more than that. So it was very healing and joyful, if I'm honest, for me to write into those mysteries.
Oh, I love it. Let's talk about sex. Yeah. And then we can involve the audience if y'all want for some audience Q&A. But I'll start because I'm selfish. There's so much sex in this book. Talk to me about desire, writing the sensual and the sexual. You write a lot of sex, not just in the Palace of Eros, but also in Cantoras, for example. What advice do you have about writing sex for those of us who are writing? What makes a good sex scene? And also, what do you think the sensual or sexual has to teach us about craft?
What does it have to teach? Wow, you ask these textured, layered questions. I'm like, okay, I hope I can attempt to hit at least part of all of those notes, because the question itself is like a brilliant edifice of thought. It's true. There's a fair amount of sex in this book. And fair, there's a lot. And my hope is that the sex is not just, you know, sort of a scene where this happens. It's not just pleasure. I mean, if people can read it and have an erotica kind of experience, that's fabulous. That's great. That's wonderful. It's life affirming, sure. But erotica is a beautiful thing. But then there's also literary writing that takes on the subject of the erotic. And I want there to be room in our literary ecosystem for like literary seriousness around the erotic, and especially the feminist erotic and the queer and trans erotic, because I do think we have a double standard in literary history, right? I mean, I think there are people like Philip Roth and Philip Roth and who else do we pick out? Like Henry Miller,
Also
you know.
don't know her.
Okay. Like Henry Miller's Tropic of Cancer, you know, was taken so seriously as a literary work, and it was all about, you know, what he thought of his parts and what he wanted his parts to do. And that's fine, but like, or it may or may not be fine, but it's a double standard, because these straight, cis, white male writers could get taken seriously as having a literary subject if they wrote about sexual or erotic or intimate desire, or about their bodies. And when a woman or trans or queer person writes about their body and their body's intimate experiences, it can be not seen as literary material. And I think that might be one of the reasons that sometimes writers, maybe emerging writers, or if you're working on a book, and people might shy away from that material, fearing that maybe it might be taken less seriously. I certainly felt that way when I was working on my third novel, The Gods of Tango, and some people have read it as a like butch lesbian passing as a man novel, and some people have read it as a transmasculine novel, and I love that, and I love both. That was a book I was writing where I was really writing my way into my understanding of my own gender all those years ago. I wasn't conscious of the ways in which I was writing like from and within my whole gender the way I was with this book. But when I was writing that book, it got so erotic, and I remember thinking, no one's going to take me seriously in the literary world, you know? But I could not write it because it just felt false to the truth of the character. What I hope is that we can have spaces to acknowledge that the erotic is both the kind of sex that people are choosing to have with each other, and also the existence of desire, right? So writing the erotic is also writing longing, writing desire, writing people sitting with the truths of what they actually want and naming or not naming and hiding and having within them as they walk down the street what they actually want. The wanting is Eros too. And so I think when we write about into desire, the truth of desire, and the truth, which is sometimes a messy truth about somebody's wanting, what they do and don't want, and also writing into the body and what the body knows. When you feel like you come awake in your body, when a character is coming awake to themselves or something about themselves through the body. And I think in queer and trans experience, erotic space can be a space of not just joy and pleasure, but also liberation, self-discovery, awakening, and sort of sourcing the vitality and courage to be able to keep on in this world.
I love it. And I want to say, there was something about reading these sex scenes as I was reading that I was thinking, it's not just the sex that's happening in this moment. There's something else. The world is shifting. Psyche is learning something about herself as a character. Her perspective is shifting. It's not just pleasure. It's pleasure, desire, but also she is liberated. She's feeling liberated. Yeah,
right,
absolutely.
that's the sexist self-discovery part,
Yeah.
right? You said it better than me. You spoke into it further, which is that writing a sex scene, like thinking about what's happening inside the character, what's being catalyzed, what are they growing or learning around in that moment? How are they growing? Like for writing a sex scene, if you are writing, that might be one piece. It's just like thinking about how is what's happening coming back to the person and what are they making of it? Just like we would write another scene, a scene of a person cooking or having an argument with their partner and, or listening to a child on a skateboard. When we write those scenes, we write into what the meaning making is for the character. And so to give it that same kind of attention.
Yeah. So let's open it up to the audience. I know that people in the back had questions. Very eager? No? Okay.
Yay, thank you for bringing excitement. That's great.
Do you have a question?
So I'm trying to think about my Dominican queer ancestors.
Yeah.
I feel like it'll affirm me and write their stories into existence, into canon, honestly.
Fantastic.
But I find myself struggling against what were their realities? And so I'm wondering how you did the archiving work of thinking about queerness in a different century.
Right. I'm so glad you're doing that work. Thank you for doing that work.
I love that question too.
Yes, and keep on. But that is really a very tricky space, right? Is we see the silences in the archive. And those are, they are systemic silences. It's not just like an accident. It's like, oh, there were no queer and trans people telling their stories. No, it's that, things were silenced, people were erased, or they weren't safe to speak their truth or even, maybe live it out openly. But I think fiction, are you writing fiction? Right. So
Emily, by the way, Emily Del Carmen. You visited me in a book club once.
oh my God, amazing!
Yeah.
Hi, Emily. I'm so glad you're here. That's amazing. Thank you for coming. And again, that I think that is just such important, valuable work that we can do to breathe specificity and inhabited life back into these histories where there are official silences. I think fiction is one of the greatest tools for that because, scholars and historians, I love and admire their work. I read it deeply, but they are confined to the facts that can be found. And there are amazing facts that can be found and read and thought about. But when we are fiction writers, we can take the facts that we can gather and then combine them with other ingredients, right? Combine them with ingredients of imagination and leaping in and what might have, here I have a little detail, what might that have been like on the inside? What have I learned about how people cooked in the Dominican Republic 140 years ago? And if that mother of 5 who was waiting for her husband to come home, who was cooking, was queer inside, then what would she be thinking? Or, what would her desires be? Just, in other words, taking some things that you can you can hold as facts and then weaving and then in with them. And it is a balance between honoring the specificity of history and then taking a wild leap. And I think for me, what has helped me give me permission to take that wild leap into the imagining is to just think, I'm working on behalf of these ancestors. My intention, for better or worse, however well or poorly I achieve my goal, my aim is to create a tribute to these people, right? And that helps me be bold and be brave and take the leap. I don't know what it was like. I don't know how right I'll get it. I don't know how great a job I'll do, but I know that my aim is to serve and to create a tribute, because every single one of us in this room had lots of queer and trans ancestors in our biological lineage, in our communities. Just pure statistics. We all have them. They're there, right? And how many generations of like sweat and joy and living did it take for you to get to be born to tell these stories?
I don't have a question, but can you repeat the question when they ask it, just for the video?
Sure, yes. I want to say that I also think of this work in nonfiction as I'm writing about a nonfiction book about people who were my family when they first arrived from Haiti, what was then Colonia Saint-Domingue, to Puerto Rico, and thinking about archives and how archives were manipulated and erased violently, how my ancestors didn't have the names that they gave themselves. They had whatever name some person wrote on a piece of paper listing them as property. And I think a lot about who gets to have that power and who doesn't have that power when I'm looking at archives and thinking about the archive not necessarily being the thing that my people would have written down. And I think even when I'm writing nonfiction, I'm like, I don't care what the fact checkers think, because the fact checkers are all white and they're not queer. And so I'm going to fabulate, like Saidiya Hartman says, critical fabulation. I'm going to fabulate what I know to be the truth. And I'll fight with the fact checkers. But you have a lot more freedom writing fiction.
You do, but I'm really grateful that you chimed in around nonfiction and how you approach it there, because I think that's incredibly important too. And I learned so much from you in your work in nonfiction.
Thank you.
Like so much. So I'm glad you brought that in. I'll just add one more thing very briefly, which is for me, one of the techniques that has helped me the most in doing that work is just to read and reread and reread and reread Toni Morrison. Yeah.
Thank you for that question. Other questions in the audience?
Hi.
Do you write only for fiction readers, or how do you grab nonfiction? Because I'm a nonfiction writer, and even I was captivated by what you wrote. So how do you write for both audiences, or do you?
Oh, that's a good question. So the question is, do you write for both fiction and nonfiction audiences, or what do you do to capture other audiences, nonfiction audiences? I'm glad to hear that you were, engaged by the reading. I don't know that I think of those particular audiences as distinct, because I know there are people who read across fiction and nonfiction. I don't always know, right, who my readers are going to be, and sort of what entry point they're going to have into the work. I strive to create a balance between wanting the work to be inviting to readers, because let's be real, we all have lots of things we could be doing with our time, right? And books in our current society do compete for people's attention, even people who love reading, with so many other things, right? And so, I respect a reader's time, right? And so I want to really do my best to make something that's compelling, that has anchoring details, right? That has narrative tension, some of these elements, right? That could allow a reader to come in and hopefully remain engaged, to create what John Gardner has called a vivid, continuous dream of fiction. But at the same time, I also think it's my job to sink in and listen to what the book wants to be. And that's not because I have disregard for the reader, but because I think we have to just kind of let the book be what it is, Sometimes that means the style that wants to come through, the kind of voice that wants to come through, and try to have some radical trust that that will make something worth reading. So it's like a balance. Thank you for the question.
Hi. I have a question that maybe could be for both of you.
Yeah.
I'm a writing coach, so I work with a lot of writers, especially BIPOC, trans, queer, marginalized writers. And one of the things that folks often really wrestle with is a feeling that sometimes people call imposter syndrome, which I think is also, you could also call it internalized depression.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious, like, whether that has arisen for both of you and what you found supportive in working with that as you write.
Mm-hmm. So this is the incredible writer Minal Hadratwala. And thank you so much for being here and for that question. And so the question is about noticing imposter syndrome, also, which can also be called internalized depression among writers who are being coached. And has that existed for us, and how do we work with that? Do you want to start?
Thank you for that question. I've never suffered from that. I'm always confident all the time. Thank you.
This is why I listen to Jaquira. This is one of the 1,001 reasons.
I think emphasizing that it's internalized suppression, right? Philip Roth, who I don't know her. Philip Roth, I don't think ever had a case of imposter syndrome. I think Philip Roth sat down and was like, I'm gonna write whatever I want and I'm a genius. And there are many other people, Philip Roth types, who walk around the world thinking this. And so knowing that I may not be Philip Roth, but I'm pretty sure I have, a little something I can bring to the pages. I think reminding myself that this is internalized oppression, that this is a narrative that someone else, someone with power, wants me to believe, right? But I'm constantly talking to my students about this is a false narrative, right? The writing can always get better. You have unique ideas and a vision that nobody else in the world has. You can work on craft and keep working on craft. No one else can replicate what it is to be you. Mm-hmm. Your vision, your talent, your curiosity, all of that. That's beautiful. Your own original voice as a writer, as an artist in the world, that's beautiful. Nobody else can steal that from you. The craft, that's something that you can work on. So I think that I am too busy to feel imposter syndrome right now. I'm on deadline. I can't think about that because otherwise I'll never write anything. I think I just keep telling myself, the writing can always get better. I can keep working on this. I can keep working on this thing. And nobody else has my original voice. That's something only I can do.
I love that. It's true. No one else has your original voice, and we need it in the world.
Bueno,
así la cosa. But I love that the way that you language this, and I salute it, and it's so great to hear. And then for a counterpoint, I have had incredibly intense imposter syndrome or self-doubt as a writer. And my first novel, which took 8 years, I went around and around that and grappled with it very deeply. The thing that allowed me to go through those 8 years and ultimately finish the novel was not that I believed in myself, believed in my right to have a voice, I overcame my self-doubt, none of that. It's that there were other things that were stronger. And what was stronger for me was my obsession with the work, right? My deep fascination, obsession, my feeling of a personal need to create this book. It was a book my first novel, The Invisible Mountain, it was a book that I felt I needed to have exist in the world so that I could more fully inhabit the earth. Right, it was this intergenerational story of Uruguayans, that sort of I was writing my way back into my roots in history and queering and feministing, the image of the country in ways that felt real, but also I needed that breath. So that having that draw allowed me to have a thread to follow. And then the other side, it kind of comes back to this other question from before about taking that wild leap. It was this. I couldn't believe in myself. I really couldn't for many years around writing. But I could believe in the worth and value, and I'm just going to use the word sacred, and you can hold that in a non-religious or spiritual way, but like the sacred nature of the real stories of people whose lives and realities I wanted to portray. That mattered to me, and that felt important to me, and I wanted to do what I could to be of service to it, which is kind of like saying, it's like, right, it's connected to what you were saying about this story is going to come through you, and if we don't write it, if you don't write your own story, the world won't have it. So that's how I kind of found tricked myself into like a back door to staying with the work.
Thank you for that. I was totally lying. I feel imposter syndrome all the time.
Wait, are you being real right now?
No, yeah, I just have to remind myself that it's someone else's narrative. But all the time, this morning, I was talking to Lars like, oh my God, nobody wants to read this. No.
Jaquira, you had me. It was good. It was good. It was good. But that's how we got to walk around, actually.
Exactly.
We got to be like, yeah, well, Philip Roth did it.
That's part of the
You
lesson,
know?
though. That's part of the lesson.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah. And I do that with myself, but you did it here, and it was awesome.
We have some fun questions in the back. Angie.
I just really wanted to add to, like, one of the things you're doing for each other, is one of the things that's worked for me, is having you all affirm that my voice matters. So I think, like, grounding, like, having community and investing in community, yes, has been one of the medicines.
Having community and investing in community, having people who can reflect back to you that your work matters and is meaningful.
So that power dominant,
Yeah.
Philip Roth person that
Repeating the words for Angie Cruz. Yeah, because Philip Roth, like, he's not around anymore, but he would not be giving flying, you know what, about the Palace of Eros.
No, because he wouldn't read it. But
He wouldn't read it, but that's okay.
But, you know, what I'm saying is that I think that that's what's pulled me out. And I see you doing it for each other, and it's really beautiful.
And then you do for us.
Yeah, you do.
And we do.
Yeah. So find your people, right? Finding your
Everyone can
finding your
this.
people.
That's the thing, it's accessible, right? It's not like there's some like friendships are just investment in time. That's on the list.
Yeah.
I gotta say, I was on a plane reading that, and there were a lot of white guys next to me who really got in on it.
Hey, what?
Yeah, so I was like reading it on the computer, and there were these two like
Philip
typically cis, they were both there, and then I realised they were both reading along, so I slowed down a bit.
Was it a steamy bit?
So I just kind of looked either side, they kind of looked a bit off, and then I was like, it's okay. Just did it together. So I think there's a market. They're waiting.
Maybe it's tips for some of them. You know, like it's the self-help section for their bookstore, maybe.
It's diminishing their abilities. They're waiting.
Just some ideas, you know.
Thank you for sharing that. That's the first time I've heard that. I have a fun question. Let's say we have a millionaire in the audience. A millionaire in the audience? No? Okay. Let's say we have a millionaire in the audience who wants to make a film adaptation of the Palace of Eros.
Yeah.
Don't worry, there will be one.
Talk to me
eventually.
later, yeah.
Who will you cast as Psyche, and who will you cast as Eros? And they don't have to be actors.
They don't have to be actors. They can
No.
be writers.
Yes, they can be.
Like Jaquira Diaz and Lars Horn.
Well, I was not fishing for that, I swear. I was just fishing for myself.
I mean, I like that casting.
Oh, I like that too. Other questions? Okay, one more. Okay,
I
so
just want to say real quick, Lars Horn is also an incredible author of an amazing book called Voice of the Fish, a lyric essay. And yes, and we're goofing on you a little bit at the moment, but because we love you and respect you. And it's an incredible book. So read it.
oh, shout out to Lars. So this afternoon, as I was prepping for this and we were talking about the book at home, I think Lars asked me first, are you Psyche or are you an Eros? And so I want to ask all of you to share, if you've read the book, are you a Psyche or are you an Eros? And then Lars told me that I was definitely a Psyche because I like to have my food prepped and ready and waiting when I wake up in the morning.
It's the magical palace that just produces whatever you want. You're
Yeah.
down. Okay,
Yeah.
great. Yeah.
And also because I love a genderqueer trans puppy.
Nothing wrong with that.
So who wants to share? Are you a Psyche or an Eros? Yes.
Yes.
I have not read the book.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Thank
So
you
then
for
that's
sharing.
TBD maybe. Yeah. Thanks for sharing.
I'm gonna say Psyche because I love my partners take care of me. So,
Love that. Love that for you.
Psyche because you like when your partners take care of you. I love that.
I haven't read it yet, but if those two things are the criteria, I'm obviously also a Psyche. I know, I'm also who doesn't? Who doesn't love me?
And Lars also said, when I said, wait, so you have to be Eros. And Lars said, I'm the dark room.
Okay, I told you Lars was deep. Okay? There's a whole book of that kind of genius. Voice of the fish. You're the dark room. Boom. Just drop mic.
Any more questions from the audience? Yes, Mona.
I have a question and that also answers your last question. Because while I was reading your book, which is gorgeous, Caro. Thank you so much for such a wonderful novel. So I was reading the book and I was really struck with Psyche's journey from, being this young woman. She starts off as a girl from a village where she has no opportunity to understand or realize what she wants. And there's this journey into desire, and she begins to learn what she desires.
Yeah.
And that leads to the intoxication and the danger of freedom. Because there are moments, and I don't want to spoil them to those who haven't read the book, there are moments where she and Eros are there and freedom is in between them.
Yes.
And a big decision has to be made.
Yes.
And it was at that moment that I realized that I was both Psyche and Eros.
Yeah.
Because I recognized myself as that young girl who had no parameters for desire. Because for the longest time, I didn't even know what I desired.
Right.
I know now.
Right.
And so I've made that journey, and that journey is intoxicating and dangerous. And I'm ready to be Eros because of that journey.
Right.
So I love the freedom that you have infused in all of your books. Oh my God, that you know what I mean? So we can all be Eros.
Yes. I mean, that is amazing. Wow. Like, thank you for that incredibly beautiful, just vision and way of swimming through the ideas of the book. That is so generous and gorgeous. And also, y'all, this is Mona Al-Tahawi. We are in such a star-studded space right now. Author of, among other things, The 7 Necessary Sins for Women and Girls. And just, talk about dismantling the patriarchy. I'm always so inspired by your incredible dismantle the patriarchy writing. Yeah, she's like, no, that's not what I say. I say fuck the patriarchy. Yes, I know. And you're all about bringing that F-bomb into the thick of things. So here I just said it. Did I get in trouble? Okay.
You're fine. I forgive you.
Yeah. So thank you for the fuck the patriarchy and for all of your work and for reading the book. And that is really beautiful. And I think Psyche, exactly that, she's at the very beginning of her journey. She's very young at the beginning of the book, right? And so Eros has been living for centuries and has a different relationship to her desire, to her body, and to the kinds of ways that she navigates the world. But then we've talked a lot here about the sex and joy and pleasure in the book, but there's also drama, right? These Greek myths, they are full on telenovela level, things happen. The Olympus is total telenovela land. And so things happen, and there's drama and rupture and tension and events, exactly because Psyche learns how to want, and she learns how to name her own wants, and that makes her dangerous. Right, I opened the book with a quote from one of the best essays of all time, Audre Lorde's Uses of the Erotic as Power, in which she says, of course, women so empowered are dangerous, right? And so she becomes dangerous to the harmony of the dark room, because she's like, but what if I want this? What if I want that? What if I want something you're not saying that pushes you in some way? Then what do we do? Right? So it's about the joy and the connection, the pleasure, but it's also about freedom. Right? And also I love that you're saying, well, and I have Psyche in me and I have Eros in me, because we can say we're this one or that one. That's great. We can be all the things. You can be both. You can be a switch. You can be a both and. You can be a constellation. You know, it's like that's the beauty and joy of living like we're free.
I love that. I think we have time for one more.
And it's you.
I am partly through Cantoras.
Oh my gosh!
And I was like so obsessed, I just got House of Eros immediately. And I'm loving this theme of like queer empowerment, but like in secret. I think a subversive, like sort of like motif in both stories. I'd like to speak a little bit more to that. It's like hinting.
What was the last part?
Just your thoughts on like how we are like building this queerness and trying to like in secret, like it's
Right.
paradoxical thing to deal with. That's perfect, right? So
Right.
yeah.
So it is paradoxical, and you're so right. Like, thank you for that, and thank you for reading Cantoras, which came out 5 years ago. So thank you for reading. And Cantoras is this book that's set, over 35 years in Uruguay. It opens in the 70s during the dictatorship, and it's 5 queer women who befriend each other during the Uruguayan dictatorship. So, there is a lot of silence and danger and repression. This is based on real people who I listened to for 15 years before I wrote the book. And so for them, keeping things on the down low, keeping things under the radar, having quiet was a safety, right? Like, just because being away from the city where there's less surveillance, they could breathe, they could actually talk to each other openly and not fear arrest, right? And so there has been in our queer histories, in many different contexts, this theme about sometimes secrecy, safety, the dark room, can be a space of liberation and a space of freedom and finding ourselves, right? Or like pre-Stonewall bars, or whatever you two are exchanging little sparks about. I love it. No, but I also, so while I was writing this book, I was actually doing an oral history project where I was gathering stories of queer and trans elders of color of the West Coast. And it's actually going to be a book, which wildly comes out in May. It's never done 2 books so close together before. It's really wild. But I really felt this urge to get it out, and it's called So Many Stars. An oral history of trans, non-binary, genderqueer, and two-spirit people of color. And I have been so blown away by these people's stories. And by going into their living rooms and homes and offices and gathering these incredible stories and weaving them into a narrative book to, again, pay tribute, right? That's the intention. But I bring it up now to say that some of these folks came out, started living as trans or as some form of queer before Stonewall, or even in the 70s or in the 80s in Latin America. And they often found themselves and found a place to breathe and discover themselves in bars that, had no name on the door, no label. It was like you walk down some basement stairs, you knock a certain way, and then the door opens, and then you're in there, and then you can be gay. And then you can wear clothing that is not the gender you were assigned at birth. So I think for queer folks, there's always been this stance between sort of safe, shrouded spaces and being out in the light. And I think it's important to also celebrate the way that those shrouded spaces have allowed us to be together, to love and embrace each other, to connect, to grow, to see ourselves, to be free, but then we also have a right to the light and the streets, right?
That's beautiful. Oh. Thank you all so much for your questions and for your laughter and your light and for coming.
Thank you all so much. Thank you, Jaquira. Thank you, Word Up. You are the revolution.
And thank you, Caro, for this beautiful book. Get your copies if you haven't read it yet.